What's going on, guys, and welcome to today's video. And as you can see, we've got the WJ kind of hovering here in the driveway, and what I wanted to do was kind of do a quick walkthrough overview of my specific suspension setup. I get quite a few comments in some of the off-roading videos or the videos on this thing, or emails or messages asking what's my specific setup, what do I've got, and how do I have this thing set up. So that's what I thought we would do today, is kind of take a walkthrough from head to tail underneath this thing and let me kind of explain why I picked and chose the parts that I did. I'm going to try to link everything down in the description, all the parts and pieces. It's going to be a big long list, but I'm going to try to do that for you guys. And is this the best suspension setup possible on a WJ? No, absolutely not. Does it work really well, and is it relatively affordable? Yeah, I think so. Now, of course, there's going to be even cheaper options out there than what I have parts and pieced together. And no, this isn't just a single part click that you could just go to one website and order a lift. This is parts and pieces picked from multiple different manufacturers. So let's jump under this thing and see what I've picked, why I've picked it, and how it's holding up to all the abuse that we've given this thing off-road. So guys, I guess first things first, let's start up here in the front wheel well. Now, the main thing with this lift is a rough country 2-inch spacer lift. Now, the thing that I like about the rough country 2-inch spacer lift is it is a steel spacer, not a polyurethane or rubber or whatever. I have seen some of those break down over time, compress or crack and even break. So these steel spacers are obviously never going to break, squish, that they're always going to be the same thickness that they are. And the cool thing about the rough country ones, there is actually a bolt that goes up through the bottom of the spacer into the spring bucket and retains that spacer. So it's a little bit more secure than just a normal spacer that you'd slide onto it. Now for springs, what I have gone with, now there are a couple of factory option springs for WJs. There are the normal spring, and then a few WJs got optioned with upcountry. Now what upcountry was a 1/2 to 1 inch lift over a normal WJ Grand Cherokee, but Moog at the time, the aftermarket suspension company, made replacement upcountry springs. So that's what I've got on here, is a fresh set of upcountry Moog springs. Now another thing spring related that I did was replace the upper and lower spring isolators, front and rear, because the factory ones were very, very tired, squished, broken down rubber. So I wanted fresh new ones that were going to be a little bit thicker and not so smashed down, just to get a little teeny bit more lift out of this thing. Now jumping over to the sway bar links, these are the cool Jeep Wrangler JL factory rear sway bar links. Now I've got a really old video on these explaining, you know, guys that have done lift kits on their JLs, they're just basically throwing these things away. So that's how you're able to hopefully get a hold of these rear JL sway bar end links that you can bolt on the front of your WJ with a 2-inch plus lift, and they work almost perfectly. You've got that really nice sway bar angle here, and they are really easy to disconnect on a WJ. You just pull the bolt for that lower sway bar link mount, and you can fold that up out of the way. Now jumping over here to the shock. I did not order shocks with my rough country spacer lift. I went ahead and just ordered the spacers and then separately ordered Bilstein shocks. We really, really like these Bilstein 5100s. They work well, they don't leak, they're just a really good shock. They perform well off-road, even kind of fast, high-speed off-road. They work great, they ride great, they aren't too stiff, they aren't too soft, they're just really, really good. Here is that Bilstein number that happens to be for 0 to 2 inches of lift on a WJ. I was trying to get as much down travel in my suspension as possible, so I went ahead and bought Iron Rock Off-Road Bar Pin Eliminators, pushed the bar pins out of these Bilsteins, and bolted the Iron Rock Off-Road Bar Pin Eliminators. And all that did was move that shock mounting point from down here flush with the lower shock mount almost an inch higher up. So overall, that suspension can travel down about 1 inch more, because I don't really ever have to worry about my up travel because I'm already hitting the fenders. Because if we do notice, I am not running any extended bump stops on this thing. And yeah, I do rub the fender flares, the fenders, it does rub quite a bit, but it works well how it is, so I've just kind of left. Now, the next thing that we can easily see here is this front lower control arm. And I replaced these for 2 reasons. A, because these WJs are getting old enough that almost every single one of them, the bushings are just tired, rusty, crusty on, so you need to replace the bushings anyways. And when you lift a solid axle vehicle, you are typically losing caster, which is the front axle, how much it is rotated forward and back. So these adjustable core 4x4 lower control arms did both of those things. They have brand new rubber OE style bushings at each end, and they are adjustable, so when you're on the alignment rack, you can dial in more caster and hopefully make it drive nice and straight down the road. Again, following the bushing theme, we've got fresh bushings pressed into our upper control arms, and correspondingly we've got fresh bushings pressed into our upper control arm mounts here on the front axle. Again, all of those bushings are so tired and rotten by the time you're actually buying these things 20 years down the road. So you definitely need to replace the bushings on these things. They're all going to drive really poorly until you get the bushings replaced. Now, kind of last but not least, up front here on my WJ, I've got a JKS adjustable track bar. Now, you need to start thinking about a adjustable track bar once you're over about 2 inches or so, because as you lift that vehicle, your axle is going to move off center just with how the track bar pulls from one side to the other. So again, with that adjustable track bar, you kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone, because you have brand new bushings to replace your tired old rubber bushings in your track bar, and you've got an adjuster here that you can center the axle from side to side, get it perfectly true where it needs to go. Now, jumping here to the back, it's going to kind of be the same story. We've got our rough country 2-inch spacers here under the upcountry Moog Springs, along with our new Moog spring isolators, top and bottom, just to give us a little bit more lift. Again, here up front, we've got those core 4x4 lower control arms, which again, kill 2 birds with 1 stone, fresh rubber bushings at each end, and they are adjustable. So you can kind of fix where your axle is sitting. Once you get that thing lifted up, they'll kind of start swinging forward, so you can move that axle back just a little bit. Obviously, in the rear, we've got the rear Bilstein shocks that, again, work perfectly. Don't buy the rough country shocks. Just try to find the Bilstein shocks online separately. We've got some rear extended sway bar end links to go with the lift. I believe these are Fat Bob's off-road sway bar end links, which seem to work fine. Polyurethane bushings, that they work. That's all I can say about them. They do just fine. Now guys, under the back of my WJ, this is called the rear upper control arm, or the boomerang, or whatever you want to call it. It's a big L-shaped upper control arm which locates the rear axle. Now, we did press new Mopar bushings in the upper boomerang here just to get it fresh, because those things get tired, broken, and brittle. And one of the really important things on a WJ that cause a lot of noise is this rear upper ball joint. If you've got a bunch of clacking and clanking from the rear of your vehicle over bumps, more than likely it's going to be that rear upper ball joint. It's a real bear. There's a big nut up here at the top that you've got to get loose. Break the upper control arm loose from that ball joint, but that thing is going to cause you a lot of noise and a lot of annoyance while driving. So pretty much know you're going to want to put a fresh upper ball joint on. But that brings us to the rear upper ball joint spacer. This is a Goliath off-road, I believe 2.5 inch or 2 1/4, somewhere in there, upper control arm spacer. And what that does is move that upper ball joint up, so when the vehicle is sitting at ride height, that rear upper ball joint is not leaned over, causing excessive wear on your brand new ball joint. Again, once you're over about 1 inch or 2 inch, you really need to put a rear upper ball joint spacer if you want that ball joint to live. And guys, again, on the worn out bushing trend, go ahead and get you some new rear sway bar in-link bushings. They're going to be worn out. The sway bar is going to have a bunch of slop in it, so go ahead, get you a couple of new rear sway bar bushings just to tighten up the back end of the Jeep. It will definitely help it drive a little bit nicer. Now, jumping to kind of wheels and tires, one thing that I have added is a really super thin, about 4mm slip-on hub-centric wheel spacer. Now, what I was doing with only adding a 4mm is that was about all the thread distance I could safely remove and still have at least 8+ turns of threads here on the lug nuts. And what I was fixing with this teeny little 4mm spacer was helping my street wheels and tires not rub on the lower control arm. And you may say, well, you still rubbed. It's shiny, there's no paint there, but that's because I run 2 different wheels and tires for off-road and street. So that kind of brings us again to the wheels and tires. I'll show you what 2 sets I'm running. I run a street set and I've got an off-road set. So guys, as you can tell, I've got a set or 2 sets of Jeep Wrangler JK Sport 5-spoke wheels. And these things are outrageously plentiful. Everybody took them off of their JK Wrangler because they were the normal sport base model wheels. Nobody cared about them. They got rid of them, bought aftermarket wheels, and that's how you can find these things for outrageously cheap. I believe I bought 2 sets total, and they were $60 to $70 for the full set of 4. So again, super cheap. Look for them. Hopefully you can find a set or 2 laying around, because for the street, I have a really nice, perfect set. They look really nice. The Jeep doesn't even look like it goes off-road with these things, but the size, I am running 255/70 R17. Now, these are not LT tires because poor old WJs, you just don't want that much weight dragging them down while you're going down the road. So find you a non-LT tire for your street tires and your Jeep will greatly appreciate it. I have been super happy with these Falcon Wild Peak ATs. They've got a really cool tread design. They work good. They're nice and quiet. They're wearing great. They're just a really good tire. And in that 255/70/17 size, they're about 31 inches tall and about 10 inches wide. So they're just perfect with my 2 or 3 inches of lift or so. It looks good. They don't look too small. It just looks right. Now, when we go off-road, I unbolt the street tires and bolt on these, again, another set of JK Sport Takeoff wheels. And as you can see, these things get used. We are missing massive chunks out of the bead. The faces of the wheels, I don't know how much it'll show up, but the faces of the wheels are just destroyed. The beads are chewed up all the way around. And that's what's going to happen to your wheels if you go out and play hard in the rocks. That's why I've got a nice set here and the thrashed set for off-road. But more importantly, the size. I am running 255/75 R17. Now that is the stock JK Rubicon size or the JL Willys size. They are roughly 32 inches tall and again, a heavier LT tire, which is fine for off-road, but when you bolt those big heavy LTs on and take those lightweight non-LTs on, you really notice the difference in acceleration, braking, handling. These old WJs aren't the most powerful thing in the world. And I've even got the V8, but you really do notice that power loss with that heavy wheel and tire. That's why I don't really love daily driving with the big heavy tires on. I throw those street tires back on. So guys, that's kind of all of the suspension components, the wheels and tires that I run. We'll take one quick look at all of my skid plates on this thing, and I think that's about all of my mods. So guys, starting up front here, I've got a trail forged lower radiator support replacement skid plate. And if you haven't seen one of these before, they are a pretty large commitment mod. you are taking and cutting the factory lower radiator support that goes down and under. You're cutting that off the frame and then bolting the trail forged piece onto the Jeep. But the really cool thing about that skid plate is you are picking up 2.5 inches of front bumper clearance with that, because that original radiator support hangs down really low. So once that's cut and out of the way, the trail forged piece bolted on, you've got a lot of ground clearance, and you can be a little bit more aggressive going into rock ledges and rocks because you know that radiator is supported and it's going to be protected with a lot heavier gauge metal. Now, another really cool piece on this thing is the Taboo Customs 545 RFE transmission skid plate. Now, it does bolt to the transmission pan bolts with replacement longer bolts, but it is the only option for a WJ transmission skid plate. And after hitting my skid plate on about 3 rocks and almost gouging through it, this is definitely going to pay off on the trail. As you can see, we've already got this thing down to bare metal in multiple spots, so it's already paid for itself in a very short amount of time. Now, the next awesome part is the Iron Rock Off-Road High Clearance Center Crossmember. And what it does is replace the factory square tubing style crossmember with this really nice plate crossmember. And again, the factory crossmember hangs down to about here. With this crossmember in place, you're picking up almost 2 inches of ground clearance where it really matters. And that's right there on your breakover angle, right there in the center where you're going to be snagging rocks. With that factory crossmember on, we would constantly catch our crossmembers, get hung up on them. It was a mess. This thing is a complete lifesaver out there on the trail, gaining back some of that ground clearance. Now, connected to my crossmember is my Rusty's off-road skid plate, or at least what's left of it. This skid plate is a skid plate that you can order from Rusty's Off-Road that bolts to the factory transmission crossmember, which again, we talked about, hangs down about 2 inches further. After I put the high clearance Iron Rock Off-Road skid plate, obviously this was not going to bolt to it anymore because it was a 2-inch gap. Now, this required a ton of fab work, but if you can tell, I cut the bracket that originally came down 2 more inches, sectioned those 2 pieces together, moved the skid plate forward so I could mount it to the crossmember, so I could gain all of those 2 inches of ground clearance with the transfer case skid plate that I had with the front crossmember. But when I brought that transfer case skid plate up, the transfer case actually hung down below the plane of the skid plate, but I knew I didn't want to lower my skid plate any, so I cut a box out where that transfer case poked through and built an angled box to lower just the section where the transfer case was going to be poking through. There's even a hole here so I can drain my transfer case fluid and fill it without having to pull the skid plate down. Here you can kind of see a side profile here, so if rocks come, they can just slide along that box and come off without getting hung up. Now, obviously, this thing took hours and hours and hours of cutting and grinding and fab work and welding, so it's not going to be something terribly easy to replicate, but I'm really proud of this thing. It's held the weight of the Jeep. I drag it almost every single time we go off-roading. It's just an awesome piece that I'm super proud of on this Jeep. Now, another thing you will see under your earlier WJs or your 4-liter WJs is a big, huge, massive catalytic converter that lives right here behind that crossmember. And what we found out is that is really, really in the way when you are off-roading, crawling rocks. That huge catalytic converter gets in the way. So I replaced my cat pipe with a 2004 V8 mid pipe. And the 2004 Grand Cherokees with a V8 got 2 catalytic converters way up front at the front of the exhaust system. So you're able to swap in the 2004 mid pipe, remove that huge catalytic converter, and have a lot more flat belly under the Jeep to off-road with. Now again, moving further back, the factory muffler is a huge muffler that hangs down, has a very hard edge here at the front. And when you go off-road, you will find yourself hanging up on the front of that exhaust muffler. I happened to find a JL Wrangler factory resonator and had it welded in place of the factory muffler. I had to move it as far rearward as possible, but the cool thing about this is that it again has an angled edge to it. So even if you drag rocks, it's going to slide up and over. And I got a little bit more exhaust noise with this thing, and it does sound pretty good. Now back here at the back of the Jeep, there's really only one option for gas tank skid plates, and that's finding the factory Mopar gas tank skid plate. Now there are two different skid plates from the factory. One is called a brush guard, and it's super thin metal, very thin, very bendable. You can actually typically tell the difference if you haven't gotten used to it. Is go up behind the center where the trailer hitch is, and if you can take and just bend the metal up and down, it has the thin brush guard. And you'll probably know by now, because all of those have massive rust holes. This center area where the fuel pump lives is typically rusted out and falling off. The heavier, thicker factory skid plates for the fuel tank are very thick. You can't move them, you can't bend them, and typically they are not rusted out because they are such heavy metal. Now this fuel tank has been drug over rocks, the full weight of the vehicle has bounced down on it, and all we've got is just scratches. So you can see we've got down to bare metal all over this thing. It just doesn't care. These things are outrageously strong, and they're gonna be the only thing you need on your WJ. Well guys, super long video here talking about everything from head to tail, but some of these parts I'm kind of proud of. I've built myself that transfer case skid plate. That's a cool part. But hopefully this will be a good reference video on maybe not the ultimate WJ suspension setup, but it's what's running on mine. I've slowly parts and pieced this thing together over time, just selecting certain manufacturers' pieces, and it just works. It works well. I don't have any parts that I've had to take off and throw away because they were junk and had to replace them. All of these parts have worked, done their job, and it works so good off-road. So guys, hopefully this puts some of your questions to rest on this thing, on my setup, and hopefully this will help you guys make some good decisions on your personal WJs as you build them up, buy parts, replace parts, and hopefully it will get you out wheeling on the trail. So guys, as always, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you guys next time.